So people have asked me time and again, what is it like being high functioning autistic versus low functioning? Well, I cannot honestly say what it's like to be low functioning because I've never been quote unquote low functioning. And even with high functioning, it can vary greatly from person to person. From my personal experience, though, it's a bit like this. Imagine being the smartest kid in class and ridiculed for being a nerd one day, and the next day, because you can't put that knowledge to paper and you can't write, legibly, you're suddenly the dumbest kid in class. And all the while, you're not sure, well, okay, am I smart? Am I dumb? I don't know what it is. Where do I fit on this, spectrum, as it were. And so that's pretty much, how it turns out to be educationally in the earlier years. Obviously, we do tend to overcome that when we get to college, as there's more resources that are better equipped to help us, and and people are overall less judgmental of what your grades are at that point. But until then, you pretty much know no heaven until then. And so let's see. Now, you might wonder, well, how does that translate to social stuff where you're not being judged on your performance in class? Well, that would depend on what kind of social outlet it is. If you're talking physical education, then obviously coordination may vary from one to another. If you're not particularly coordinated, that's another outlet for kids to just, nail into you how much you suck at life. Now, if it's something a little bit more casual where maybe you're just everyone's just kind of doing their own thing, and, maybe you're at someone's house playing with some toys or something, it can translate a number of ways. Since when you're a kid, you don't have a lot in the way of freedom, I want to say, because, you're told when to go to bed, you're told to go to school, even if you don't want to. You're pretty much forced to do everything adults tell you to do in and out of school, with the exception of what you do during your playtime. That being the case, someone who's high functioning and feels like an adult trapped in a kid's body, as I was, that to me was probably the worst hell I could imagine, and therefore I fear no hell, because I've already been there. And on that note, it may be not so unusual that the kid comes off as, bratty, controlling, or in general just hard to work with. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why does he act that way? Well, think about it this way. Imagine that you're probably in a world that you're having the hardest time understanding. And let's say you were to take a rocket ship to Mars, and let's say that you had a way to survive the landing there. And let's say there was other life forms there, just for example purposes, and they spoke a language you didn't know, or whatever, or the way in which they spoke was completely foreign to you, even though they spoke the same language as you. That's about how awkward it would be in general. Now, what does that have to do with being controlling at playtime? Well, for starters, it may not occur to them that they that other people, want this or that because they don't pick up on social cues that well. Secondarily, it could be an issue of maybe they do pick up on the social cues, or maybe they do have some realization of it, but to cope with maybe a hostile environment that they're used to being in, or to cope with the fact that this is the one time in the day that they can have any control of anything. They crave it. They want it. And nothing will stop them from getting what they want. So, that is why I think they can be controlling at playtime to the eyes of the uninformed. So, that brings me to another aspect. It is known that they tend to be very rigid to rules. They'll follow them to a T and expect everybody to be punished equally for the same crime. Now, that sounds like an admirable trait to have, but if someone isn't caught doing something that they catch them doing, they may feel the need to take the law into their own hands if they don't see that they're being punished for the same thing they get punished for. And so that leads to a lot of problems down the line, and from the perspective of someone who's not paying attention to their class as well as they should, it seems like the Aspie guy's just going nuts, and they can't figure out why. So they send the inspection people to the home. They find out, oh, well, the parents aren't abusing him, but either they'll overlook the siblings, or if it's not any of that, maybe it's just the condition of the syndrome and they're overlooking some seemingly minor detail that could be having a greater impact than they realize. And so, unless they ask direct questions, how's an Aspie to know to tell you what's going on? Anyway, now another thing, when they get a little bit older and they start to kind of care a little bit more what people think of them, because at some point they realize that they have no friends and now they got to go out and make more because otherwise they're just by themselves all the time. Then when they reach the point of maturity whereby they care what others think of them, but they pretend that they don't because they don't want to be hurt. You get to events like maybe... I'll use the Prancing Skilter as an example because it's one I go to frequently. It's a furry meet, and I understand there's probably more than a few people in the fandom on the spectrum because, hey, what's more attractive to someone than a place where you can be yourself and nobody gives a damn? Well, on that note, what my usual tactic when I'm there, and people didn't quite understand it at first, but I think they're starting to kind of get it now, is when I was there, I didn't want to make a bad first impression, because we're told all our life, oh, first impressions are everything. So what I often do is, if I'm not familiar with a person, I'll tend to, in order to avoid making a bad first impression, observe how they interact with other people, kind of like a machine trying to understand how humans operate. And I will kind of listen in on what they're saying. I mean, not to say that I would, eavesdrop for malicious intent or anything. I'm just trying to figure out, well, okay, what kind of things does this person like? But I don't want to interrupt them because, I've been trained all my life, no, don't interrupt people, it's rude, it's disrespectful, they're gonna get mad at you if you do. And so I wait until they finish their conversation on whatever they're doing. I process in my mind, what things were said, what kinds of expressions they seem to be taking with certain things. Now that I've kind of had enough therapy to do that, and I think, okay, is this the kind of person I want to associate myself with? Is this the kind of person who'd be welcome to somebody who's a bit different like myself? Now, it sounds kind of shallow, it sounds kind of judgmental for me to do this, but I think at some level, we all kind of subconsciously do that to some extent, whether we're aware of it or not. And so if it turns out that they seem like they'd be hostile to the idea of such and such, I don't bring it up to them, or I don't even interact with them at all. I'll look at the next, group of people that seems remotely interesting. And if they happen to touch on a topic that I'm particularly passionate about, sometimes, I'll talk with them either after or if I see an opening to speak. And before I know it, oh goodness, I've turned it into a lecture by accident. My bad. And other times it ends up being a case of, well, if I've come in at the wrong time or I didn't realize it was a personal conversation, I can take it very personally when they tell me, oh, it's an AB conversation, see your way out of it. I'm like, okay. Oh, and a third thing, I understand that some of the people that do that are also on the spectrum too, because I myself have difficulty maintaining conversation with more than one person. Because let's say I'm talking to somebody about something in great detail, and then all of a sudden this other guy comes out and says, "Hey Adam, how you doing?" And I might say hi to them, and a brief small talk, but then I completely forget what I was talking about with this other person. The other person seems to be getting agitated that we've suddenly been interrupted, but I haven't the balls to say anything about it to that effect, or I don't seem to have the capabilities to return to the previous discussion or find a way to interweave the two into it, because I'd completely, my mind just went from, totally on track to, whoa, what the, and so that's why I'm a little bit more sympathetic, when people prefer to talk one-on-one, and that's why I tend to, in general, assume that that's how people want to keep things, unless I know them particularly well and I know that they're okay with multiple people talking to them at once, So I'm really trying to be everyone's friend, and sometimes that can be stressful for me, and sometimes I can, get angry, and sometimes I take out my frustrations in life on people I think aren't acting the way I should. Because, I'm going off of what I consider to be an impossible standard for myself, let alone anybody else. I'm trying to be that perfect person. I'm trying to be that guy who'd do anything for his friends, and I expect that in kind, if I show that I'm willing to go the extra mile for someone, they're going to go the extra mile for me. But I understand that for some people that, while I can, do unusually kind things for people because I have the resources to do it, not everybody has the same resources, and so I can see where that would be unreasonable on an intellectual level. Nevertheless, emotions are emotions, and on the topic of emotions, I would say that the hardest thing for me when playing pretend or otherwise, role-playing people call it, it's difficult to separate myself from my characters, because the characters that I use are very much, a piece of myself in a way. And so it's hard for me not to feel what my characters feel when I either write about them or I pretend to be them. Some people call it method actor syndrome or otherwise, but whatever you call it, the fact remains, excuse me, it's difficult for me to separate, real from not real sometimes. Not on an intellectual level, of course, but emotionally speaking. It's like, to put it in perspective, it's like if you ever played house when you were a kid, and you guys played out a scenario that you feel particularly strongly about, like, and I've never had this problem myself, but this is just for example purposes. Let's say that, the girl says, oh, our kid wet the bed again, and let's say that kid actually did wet the bed the night before or the night before that. They might feel a little bit uncomfortable playing that out a bit, or they might even get angry, but meanwhile the girl has no idea that she's triggered him, and or why he's upset about the topic even coming up. So that's just a fairly seemingly innocuous example of how it would be difficult to separate oneself from fantasy and reality if the two intertwine at a deeper level. That is, if your character is annoyed by the same things you are, it's difficult not to be annoyed by them when they come up. Or if there are things that piss you off that also piss off your character, how do you separate the two? So that's pretty much, what I have to say on that note. Whew. Keep in mind, I'm not reading from a script here, so this is all in my head. This is all I'm trying to explain from best I understand the struggles that exist. Now, you may say, well, heck, at least you can speak your mind. At least you can do something, The issue is, I'm kind of on that awkward line of people wouldn't detect it in me unless they knew what to look for. And not having it at all. So for me, on the higher end, to have to listen to what people say, that if to be on the spectrum they can't speak, or they must be retarded because they can't speak, because we associate what they can say with what they know. But if there's anything I've learned, with the right assistive technology, you could see that they're every bit as articulate as the spoken autistics if given the right tools. That being the case, yes, there will be some people who are better at some things than others, but in general, that tends to be the truth. And another thing, Autism Speaks wants you to think that all cases of autism are as extreme as possible to get, money. Now, I could forgive their fear-mongering if not for the fact that they do so little. You can look it up to help actual living autistics and spend more time trying this eugenics genocide, scheme that they got going on, where they're trying to prevent cases that may not be all that bad and may actually help them to succeed in what they're passionate about. Now, there's really no way to know whether a case is going to be so extreme that they need help just functioning in everyday situations, or if it's going to be mild enough that they can use it to their advantage to help them get things done. And I understand that piece, and I understand there's an element of, well, don't let them suffer. Excuse me. Normally I consider myself pro-choice. Like, if someone's living in a state that, that if they were a kid again, they wouldn't want to be in. I get not, not having the money to take care of them the way they deserve. And there's already a lot of babies up for adoption that nobody's, adopting. And they age out of the system and become the bums you see on the street corners at times. Understandably speaking, that's not, those cases are probably the only time I could justify such eugenics, if then. And if you're going to exercise that kind of eugenics, it should always be the choice of the person who's having that happen. Don't sterilize someone just because it's going to save you money. You know, you have to consider their feeling on it. Are they the type that is just so selfish that they want to have the kid anyway? Or are they good enough to wait until they're out of that situation? Because for some people, poverty isn't lifelong. You know, they can get out of it if the right resources are given to them. That's the other thing. So the last thing you want to do is neuter or spay your human when when they might get out of the situation for which they were put in. Arguably, disabilities don't work that way, but at the same time, some people can function even with the disability and prove themselves useful to society at large. And I think more and more as technology develops, even people who used to not be able to work at all will find a way to make themselves useful. I'm very utilitarian in general, so if you can find a use for even the most useless, I'm on board for it. Rather that than, than eugenics, considering all the evil it's done to people who really weren't that bad off. The other thing that's wrong about it is it bases itself on the idea that if you're a genius, your kid's going to be a genius. But if you look at any genius, were their parents geniuses? Probably not. So just because someone has a disability really bad doesn't mean their kids are going to have it that bad or at all. It's like saying if your mom and dad developed cancer, the kid's automatically going to develop cancer. Well, there's a higher risk of it. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to develop the cancer that their parents had, or it at all if they take good care of themselves. So to say that that a certain person shouldn't reproduce simply because they have genetic disadvantages, is in that respect idiotic. Because while there is a higher probability that such disadvantages will occur, it's not a guarantee. Well, that's about all the time I have for this video. If you'd like to know more, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to this video. Talk to me on social media. Talk to me in the comments section. However you want to communicate. This has been Adam Thomas Applebaum, the Forsaken Scribe and Adathor Rules. Out.